So here's an example of a third-class family. These are the Goodwins. They were traveling in third class. They had actually booked aboard another steamship, but because of the coal strike, found themselves aboard Titanic. Before this picture was taken, or after this picture was taken, baby Sydney Goodwin was born. So his photo is there on the right-hand side. Baby Sydney is important because he was found in the wreckage, and his body was buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but he remained unidentified because he didn't have any ID on him. There was no one nearby that was identified to, kind of inform who he was. So forever and ever, there are these beautiful baby shoes in the collection of the Titanic Museum, and they really wanted to know who this baby was, give him a name, give him his identity back. So through DNA testing in the 2010s, they actually finally were able to track down that this was in fact Sydney Goodwin. So his gravesite right there, they were finally able to add his name down there at the bottom. So he was just 2 years old, but he finally has a name. Edith Corse Evans was a first-class passenger who had gone to a fortune teller recently, and she was telling some of her friends aboard Titanic about it. The fortune teller said to beware of water. And when it came time to go up to the lifeboats, Edith, I'm not sure if she heard those words and stay clear of water, but she hesitates and waits for the next lifeboat and does not go with her friends. She reportedly allowed her friend who had children to get into the lifeboat before her, but obviously the fortune teller had it pretty good. She called it to beware of water, but it did not end well for Edith. She perishes in the disaster. Eva Hart, seen here with her mother and her father. They were traveling in second class. The Harts were supposed to be on a different ship, but because of that coal strike, found themselves aboard the Titanic. And her father thought it was the greatest thing to be on the most luxurious ship of all times. But the mother was very hesitant and cautious because she thought that calling something unsinkable was flying in the face of God. And she had a premonition, the only time in her life that she ever had one, that something terrible was going to happen at night. So every single day while they were aboard Titanic, she would sleep all day and stay up all night, kind of waiting for this terrible something. And on April 14th, the terrible something of the iceberg happens. They all go up to the boat deck, and Eva and her mother make it off the ship. The cool part is that Eva is outspoken. There are many interviews available on YouTube. Again, I will put some links here below. Benjamin Guggenheim. So he was a millionaire aboard Titanic, supposedly aboard with his mistress. When his steward came by to tell him to get up to the lifeboats, the steward handed him a life jacket and pushed him up there, and realized that he hadn't put this life jacket on. So the steward, took him back to his cabin, put on the life jacket, which is kind of not comfortable. They're all made out of these weird chunks of cork. They're kind of restrictive, but it's meant to save your life, not be comfortable. He threw a sweater over top of that, threw on a jacket, and sent Mr. Guggenheim back up to the boat deck. So the steward continued to check on other people that he was in charge of, and came back later to find that Mr. Guggenheim has changed out of his life jacket and sweater, has dressed in his tuxedo and top hat, and is kind of waiting on the boat deck. And he says, "Mr. Guggenheim, what on earth are you doing?" And he says, "I have dressed in my finest, and I'm prepared to go down as a gentleman. I'm not stupid. I can tell how many seats there are available on the lifeboats, and women and children first. So I've written this letter to my wife. If you should survive, could you please make sure that she gets that?" So unfortunately, Mr. Guggenheim does perish in the disaster. Again, not ever sure, knowing what your fate's going to be, could you change into your tuxedo and top hat and, dressed in your finest, prepared to meet the end. Margaret Brown was never called Molly during her lifetime. So the unsinkable Molly Brown is really a Hollywood musical creation. She was referred to as Maggie. So Maggie Brown was an incredible woman. She and her husband struck it rich in Colorado. And she started a lot of social programs within her town, especially when the mines that her husband owned had to close. She wanted to make sure that the townsfolk were taken care of. She was traveling in Europe, having a lovely time. And when she gets into the lifeboat, she is insistent that, as there are people in the water, that the boat actually go back for survivors. Now, unfortunately for her, in her lifeboat, the person in charge is Quartermaster Hitchens, the gentleman who was actually at the wheel when Titanic hit the iceberg. So you can imagine his mental state was pretty unstable at that point, very pessimistic view. And he actually does threaten that if she doesn't shut up about it, that he will throw her overboard. So Maggie Brown, stops shouting to go back, but she does encourage the women to keep rowing, to keep them warm, and try to lift their spirits throughout the whole ordeal of the many hours they were out there waiting for a rescue ship. She's also incredible in that she wanted to thank the people who were involved in their rescue. And the rescue ship, the Carpathia, Captain Rostron here, she commissioned Congress to help pay for a silver loving cup to thank the captain, and these Titanic medals for each of the crew members who was aboard that rescue ship that night. So one of the many, many sad stories of this night is the Allison family. Bess and Hudson were traveling with their two beautiful children, and Lorraine and baby Trevor. And there was a nurse also who was involved in caring for baby Trevor because he was tiny. And when the call went to go up to the boat deck, the nurse actually took baby Trevor without telling anyone, got into a lifeboat, and then was sent off the ship. So a distraught Bess Allison, of course, looking for her baby, not finding him. And even when Hudson tried to get her to get into a lifeboat and just trust that the baby was safe somewhere, still wouldn't do it. And unfortunately, they spend the rest of the time up until the sinking looking for poor baby Trevor. So all three of the Allisons that remained on the ship perish, including little Lorraine here. This nurse obviously thinking she's doing something good, saving the baby. You can see how she's portrayed in the newspapers. It's kind of interesting. So this is the actual photo of her with the baby. But then the newspapers altered it to make it look like she was super sinister, like she was stealing the baby or, doing something bad. Regardless of what her intentions were, it was a very tragic moment as the family perishes as a result of her actions. So Michel and Edmund Navratil were with their father, Michel Sr. Michel and their mother were unfortunately having kind of a separation. They were kind of moving towards divorce. So the children were with their mom in France, and Michel picked them up to spend his time with them. But instead of just taking them home, he takes them aboard the Titanic. And as they go up to the boat deck, Michel realizes that he can't get into the boat because he's not a woman or a child, and he's kind of put his babies in danger. And so he sets both of them into a lifeboat, luckily. And he says, when your mother comes to gather you, please let her know that I wanted her to follow us to America to start a new life, for us to be happy and reunited. And please tell her that I'm sorry. So unfortunately, Michel Sr. passes away in the disaster. But little Michel and Edmund are saved. What makes this such an interesting story is that these poor kids, they only speak French, and they can't really identify themselves per se. They know their first names, but they can't really tell where their dad is or where their mom lives. So they take this picture in the center and they start circulating it in magazines and newspapers across the globe to see, whose children are these. So luckily the mother in France does find this picture and contacts the White Star Line to get her children back. And the White Star was very kind in paying for her passage to come get the children and then take them home again. So she is reunited with her babies. So the Navratil boys. Isidor Straus came from Bavaria when he was a child. He actually ended up being a Confederate Army blockade runner during the American Civil War. He and his brother Nathan eventually invest in and found Macy's department store. And he and his wife get the chance to travel quite often. Ida wasn't feeling very well, so they were out on the Riviera taking a vacation. So when the call goes to go up to the boat deck, the Strauses get up to a boat pretty easily as first-class passengers, and Ida gets into the boat, and Isidor steps back. And the gentleman in charge of loading the boat says, Mr. Straus, I don't think that anyone would object to a man of your age getting into a lifeboat. And he looks around and he says, not before the younger men. Ida, of course, not being stupid, knows that there really is not going to be another boat for Isidor. So she gets out of the lifeboat. And Isidor says, what are you doing? And she says, I've spent my entire life with you, and where you go, I go. And the two of them are seen on the boat deck, basically holding each other until the end, Ida choosing to die with her husband as opposed to go on without him. So towards the end, as the lifeboats are being launched, many people recall hearing the band play on deck to keep people calm. There is an argument as to whether or not there was a song playing at the very end, what that last song was. Some say it was Autumn, which is kind of a jazz tune. There's also Song of Autumn, which I think is a hymn, We're Nearer, My God, to Thee. And having researched a little bit about Wallace Hartley, he was a 33-year-old, and he told a newspaper and his friends many years previous that if he should find himself at a shipwreck, knowing he's going to go down with the ship, what would he like to play? And he said, Nearer, My God, to Thee, kind of as his own funeral. All of the band members perish in the disaster. Wallace Hartley's violin was a beautiful gift from his fiancée, Maria, and was recently discovered in an attic a few years ago. And through much testing and confirmation, they did, in fact, confirm that this is Wallace Hartley's violin. It was in a case that he was able to strap to his body. And when his body was picked up after the disaster, the violin was the thing that they were able to give his fiancée as his belongings. She apparently had put it in the attic and never really wanted to speak about it again.